I'd like to start with Robert on that one.
To me, it stays grounding bedrock in the same sense that Ed Sanders speaks of fact of what he wrote, various pieces of it staying in one's mind forever. That never remarkably changed. I think the most particular transformation for me was when I realized he was 15 years older than I was. I had imagined him as an absolute peer and contemporary, and I suddenly realized he was this other person who had written this extraordinary book called Me Ishmael, and that he had both a range and a professionalism that I had not even yet begun to enter, and that was intimidating. But for whatever reason or circumstance, our friendship had a remarkable opening capability for both of us, by which I mean simply that he gave me the world, and in a peculiar way I was able to help him in some similar way. He absolutely made the world for me, that's it.
And it's that dialogue is so wonderfully dramatized in the volumes of your correspondence with Charles in the Black Sparrow series. I've been looking at those again recently, and it's just so wonderful to see that and to be able for all of us to have that to refer to and live with. Yeah, I want to ask Ed, what's the importance of Charles's work for you?
Right now, his work as a city planner. He was the first guy that I ever knew that actually talked about protecting tidal wetlands. And when I would visit him up here, and I used to come up now and then to hang out, he was the only guy, first guy I met that you went to the second restaurant after the first one. First Chinese, then Italian, you have an arpeggio of restaurants. Anyway, we would take walks and he would point out things he wanted protected. And now I find myself 30 years later studying and thinking about what he did in my own bioregion in terms of conservation and protection. So I view him as his works as the most gifted of people concerned for actually the environment. He was the first environmentalist, I guess, I ever really met and talked with. And I read his poetry now, especially the shamanic-like later poems where he would rev himself up. It's a technique I try to use myself sometimes. I like those later poems. I read his essays. I still read projective verse quite regularly and use it in lectures. I don't know, I mooch off him, okay? He is the most elegant mooch you can find because he wasn't a perfect guy. He had many foibles, but you dig in this data retentive era, you dig into the private life of any man or woman and it gets pretty ghastly sometimes. But he had his pluses and his elegances and his great pithy, gnomic, maxim-based writing is worthwhile to study. It's very difficult, and I'm now just learning to read some of these early poems and learning what they mean about that I sort of know, but I am learning. So they're like the Bible. You study the outside and wiggle your way into the inside, and it's worth doing. He is a great writer and a great American and a great Roosevelt Democrat.
Amen. In this day and age of hating government, right? Vincent, what about the impact of Charles's work on you? Charles as a poet. Get in the mic.
For me to answer that question, I have to read from this paper so that you'll get a good sense of how this man affected me. The air is a page you write on as Chalio did, and I do. He called me his twin and said that we were co-kings. His astronomical signature is climb the highest mountain barefoot. Mine is mermaid. He's of the head and I'm of the heart, exchanging them. He's Capricorn, I'm a Cancer. This is the tale of the big kid and the little kid. I'm with the women who say, don't tell me what you think, tell me what you feel. He scolded me in 3 poems of the Maximus. If the roles were reversed, I would have done what he did, only differently. We have a schizoid situation where everything is split, heart from head, mind from body, private from public, art from life. One of the 4 winds had a diagram where Gloucester is north 42 degrees, 37 minutes, west 70 degrees, 40 minutes. He has a poem in the Maximus in the shape of the diagram, which is like an upside-down cross which says, my shore, my sounds, my earth, my place. Afterwards, in between, and not since. In No Fish, I have a poem in the same shape, only opposite, which says, no one can have it. A pillar. This is the clincher and propeller. It is on top of this. It is on top of his, and it is called the engine, which together they are. The North Shore magazine of Gloucester Daily Times had 2 articles about Olson, which singled out the summation of Charles Bohr's experiences as host to Charles's stay at his house in his book, Charles Olson in Connecticut, where he said, there was no let-up in your demand for attention. I began to be consumed by you, drained, devoured. Now let's go back a bit. In 1964, I forget the date, I drove Charles, Betty, and Charles Peter to the South Station, and Betty had not made up her mind to go with him to Buffalo. He chatted all the way, and at the last 5 minutes, she decided to go. It changed their lives, all 3 of them. When I heard about the accident, I sent them, I went there immediately. After that, Charles was never the same. Deep in his gut, he knew he was facing an unsurmountable obstacle knocked off that highest mountain. The last 6 years of his life were the loneliest I had ever seen anyone in. We met a number of times, and he was bowed because that mountain was on his back. He was a driven one. The daemon had its grip, and his fate was inexorable. So don't judge him if you have not lived in his flesh and bones and in his head. Now, if you want to understand the Maximus poems, you have to read George Buttercutt's Guide to the Maximus Poems. It's all there, because he too gave his life to Olson. Without George, who died at 45, if I remember correctly, the works of Olson would be in the hands of other less gifted scholars. Then who knows? Charles Olson was the cross between black and light magic, and he drew his believers with his pleroma. Not long after he met me, he read my books at the Lynn Public Library, and No Smoke, a graphic tale of Lynn during the Great Depression, told a bell inside his eyes, and I am in Gloucester. I came back from the New York Living Wake with a copy of his Human Universe inscribed to Mary Shaw and myself in a death's hand. I was drenched to the marrow, and figuring the weight of eternity was going to get me, I gave that copy to Peter Anastas. I was caught up in him and he in me. I wrote a section of The Navigators, Book 3 of No Fish, 46 pages of the dreams, or out of the body traveling with Maximus and some others. Olson was a son of Hermes, one of the greatest of thieves. He could lift anything from anyone, and that person could never know except for another son of Hermes. The universities at large are afraid of Charles Olson because he's a teacher of teachers, and his method is dangerous to the status quo. A rebel education will catch up to. When he's buried long enough to be safe, and those authorities will choke on his words. There's more going on than meets the eye or the ear. Olson was in a state of love, but he was intoxicated, very one-pointed, and so am I, star-studded, as those who are awake.
Thank you, Vincent. I'm going to ask anyone on the panel who would like to say something about this next question. Would you agree with the characterization that some have made of Olson as patriarchal? Anyone want to talk a little bit about that?
Just briefly, Peter, I remember that when Fee Dawson was to publish his Black Mountain book, in which he configures or places Charles primarily as father, that Charles said, if he publishes that, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to go get him. I mean, he did not seemingly enjoy or he didn't like the sense of being the father. And yet, I think partly because of size, but even more to the point because of situation, there were many, many indeed who were claiming him as that resource of presence. He was not primarily a fathering person, paradoxically. That wasn't his guise or nature to be father in primary sense. I think that was sadly a vulnerability. Yeah.
What about you, Ingeborg?
Yeah, I felt he was, definitely. But you see, I knew him when he had just become a father, I think.
Yeah.
And also, I think that he was a father in a very grand sense, more a Prospero, you know, in the Shakespearean sense, that he would move, use magic to save you.
Yeah.
You know, like Prospero, I mean, he moved heaven and earth just to marry that silly girl off safely, you know. And Olson wanted us to...
She was his daughter, you know.
Yeah. But anyway, Olson wanted us to be safe within ourselves. And in that sense, I felt that he was a father. But he didn't want us to leave and then betray what we'd found at Black Mountain College.
Well, I hear what you're saying. Just speaking of in particular relationships, he had a seemingly harder time.
Yes.
Remember he said once to me, I need a college to think with. And in some paradoxical sense, he needed a college to live with also.
Well, you see, he didn't have any responsibility when I knew him because the Europeans were running the school, yeah, and they had come away from so much danger that they had a need to make it a safe place. It was very orderly. And he didn't have to worry. He just came. He had a salary of $120 a month, and he came and went, and sometimes unexpectedly. And he had, I think, probably a lot of fun that year because he didn't have any responsibility.
Well, again, he had, you know, as they used to say, he had a wife and
yeah,
but another old friend is called hostages to fortune.
Well, she was only there once, as I remember.
Yeah, but I don't mean to make this some simplistic reduction by any means, but I think that the kind of enlargement of Charles to some Vedic, you know, not to say you're doing it, as you said, put it very aptly, as a student in relation to Charles in particular context, he was an immensely engendering and supportive person. He could also be, as others have made clear, very destructive in that same role. He was, you know, he could swing his weight around, and if you were on the other side of it, it was very, very unhappy.
Yeah, but I think that the interesting thing that I found about him was that although I was so different, you know, and came from such a different milieu,
Quite, and with Hetty and other women I know about, quite meaningful relations, equal relations, even deferential relations with women.
Thanks, Ed. One of the things that people who knew Olson remember is his gentleness. He could be an incredibly loving and gentle person. One time during the summer of 1966, I was coming out of the post office next door, and Olson was sitting in the doorway of the then Central Grammar School with his lap full of mail. He had come up, he'd been out of town and come to get his mail at the post office, and he was sitting there looking through all his mail. And I was kind of depressed. My father-in-law had just died. I had been out of Gloucester and really was sort of out of sorts. I was in graduate school that time at Tufts and not very happy about it. And so I complained to Charles that I couldn't get any writing done. And Charles put his arm around me and looked down into my face and into my eyes, and he said, "Just live. The writing will take care of itself." And that has stood me in good stead. And it was an example of Charles's gentleness. I want us to talk a little bit. What do you think people in Gloucester, those of us living here today now, should know and memorialize about Charles Olson? What do you think, Jean? What do you think people in Gloucester should know about Charles? What should we remember? What should we care about Charles?
About him?
Yes,
I mean,
about,
in
yes.
relation to Gloucester, it was, it was the love of his life to come back here. And that was I think, the only time I've ever seen Charles speak directly to a city and wanted to control it and dictate how all that should be saved and taken care of. And, you know, he just loved it, and all his work so much was built around it. And I think he was an asset to the world just by that intelligence. As I always say, he had a very good sense of people. Without their knowing, he would open ways for you to see. And I always thought that was remarkable.
Thanks so much. Vincent, I wanted to ask you, I'm also going to ask Robert, because Robert has actually lived here too. And well, I think I'll start with Robert, because I think you've been here and
Right.
have a feel for this place.
Well, growing up in West Acton, for example, Gloucester was the edge of the sea. This is an attractive, specific place, whether one had come in through Captain's Courageous or the Norman's Woe or whatever. The point was it was a very extraordinary place, only that small distance finally from Acton. It seemed to me, for example, growing up in Acton, West Acton specifically, that the fact that Captain Isaac Davis made it to the, to that by the Root Bridge that arched the flood, et cetera, that he had made it literally to the bridge in Concord, thus to dignify our terrific town forever, 8 miles to the north, that kind of presence of fact for a place really matters. It doesn't give it simply a dignity, but it gives it a measure and a particularity. It's what people do, after all, that qualifies what kinds of life and what kinds of relationships they have in a place. Olson's immense use to Gloucester is the way he particularizes and locates the fact of Gloucester as a human community, much as Ed emphasizes as the first environmentalist he'd ever met. Olson gives locus and name and not just information, but he particularizes. He lives here in the most actuating sense. As I came in the back road today, I came over through Essex. It was Charles, characteristically, who gave me once this lovely copy of Hands Up, the story of the Stories, shipbuilding, and writes in a little note, says, a Hershey bar. And then coming on in, for example, I came past your terrific frame shop, and you know, it began to look, I thought, of the drive into Rocky Neck where Gene used to be, et cetera, et cetera. But the whole particularization of the place was so specific, from not just having Olson to tell me, but Olson to locate, give me place, orientate me, as he would put it. He's an immensely actuating person in that way, initiating, absolutely to be valued. Like the greatest aspects of Thoreau or anybody else who ever did this. Yeah.
What would you add, Vincent? What should we remember about Charles in Gloucester? What?
Well, there's so much that it's hard to pinpoint anything specific, except in the sense that when I dealt with Lynn, a shoe city, where I grew up, and I came to Gloucester, and I realized that I was in a place that was very close to me. And when I met him, he suddenly was already into his own life, and Gloucester was his property. And he was very possessive, as most people who come to Gloucester, they find a specific view of the water, and they feel as though they own Gloucester. So he really owned Gloucester, and it was his property. So I can see there was a conflict between me and him along that idea that who was going to write about Gloucester. So all I can say is that we were both pig-headed.
I was going to ask Hetty, because you published some of Olson's poetry, and what would you like us in Gloucester to remember about Olson as a poet?
Well, I didn't get to Gloucester, just to trace my own feeling about this, I didn't get to Gloucester until, almost a decade after I first read poetry about Gloucester, which had assumed this mythical place in my mind. And I know that there are a lot of people out there like me who know Gloucester through these poems, and for whom the landmarks then come alive, as they always do with any storybook. I remember reading, if I can digress a moment, the book Make Way for Ducklings to my children, and then...
Remember this funeral home where he was at rest? Anyway, the funeral home. And he would, it proved to me what a person of the people he was. This guy walked in, I think he was, my friend George Kimball had gone down to the fishermen's bars, and they were talking about Charles down there. And this guy walked in and he looked at Charlie, and he was not a poet, he was not a professor. He said, "Charlie, you're beautiful." And then he walked out. And that to me is an emblem of what Gloucester can use on one level in treating of Charles. That is, he was, from his early years in politics, what he was. And then he came to this town with or this city as an act of complete love, and reached his soul and spirit out to all the streets. And I remember him showing me those tidal wetlands and the buildings he wanted to save. And I remember being in a restaurant with him once, and he pointed across a cove, and he said he'd been into the city vault and discovered that the land over there actually belonged to Gloucester, and he was going to try to make sure that that became part of the city, as I remember. So I mean, no one has loved a city with some anger added, as Charles Olson loved this wonderful town. I call it a town because compared to New York City and Baltimore, it probably just about is a town, but it is a city, and we fought, I don't know, all over the world people follow this town. I used to have up in my study a map of Gloucester Harbor, and that was years before, that Charles gave me years before I came here. So, I don't know, it's a difficult thing to honor a thorny poet, but he's no more thornier than Ovid.
Just as a quick footnote to Ed's point, I just came from Auckland, New Zealand, and there was a young graduate student there I was working with on Charles Olson. who came to the first meeting and brought out all these charts of your harbor and knew all the points of your town. That's as far in the human universe as you can go.
Was Olson's activism part and parcel of his whole life? Or was it something that he took on necessarily in Gloucester? Anybody like to speak to that?
Yeah. I think that he was never a spectator wherever he went.
Anybody else have anything to say about this particular experience of Olson? Yes, Rob.
Just one quick. Yeah. No, I knew that he had a great antipathy for what he called epicene poets, poets who did not enter or participate directly in the conduct of the society, who were effectively either provided by its authority and or who looked at it, quote, objectively. They can take no risk that matters, the risk of beauty least of all. That sense.
Action in the community affects him, the family, and the community. So, in other words, his intensity was such that few people could measure up to it. And when I say that many people are asleep, is because they are unaware of the fact that they could have a vital impact on what takes place in society. So his vision was so clear that he was ahead of people, sometimes too far ahead. That's why he probably wanted to teach the teachers, so that when he was gone, they would teach him. So he was smart that way, because he had to get his vision across. So I think it's really the intensity with which you perceive self and society that counts, and he had it acutely.
Could we call the Maximus poems a political poem in some way? Somebody want to talk about that?
In the sense, I don't know. And you want to say in the sense that the personal is political?
I was speaking before.
Concerned about what's called now in proper circles as a sustainable economy. And so I can read in some of the poems there. The problem that, as Charles so clearly focused, it's difficult to be both a historian and a poet. So I think the political, you have to brush away some of the quotidian, some of the daily toil and grind of politics, which is quite hideous in its daily exactitude to grab those universals. So his anger or his concerns would dip in and out of more universal themes that he brought to it through his researches in mythology and ancient cultures. So it was a divine matzah brei of past and present, with some fragments of anger over the bullshit happenstances of the politics of the day, the tearing down in the 60s of beautiful buildings allegedly to have urban renewal, which angered him, or the filling in of wetlands to make malls, which is still going on across America. And Olson would be screaming today at the ruination of wetlands.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to have a summation here.